Hello and welcome to the 37th edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paul Logidici, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss immigration in Central Europe with Jan Kovař. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yep,
I
thank you
appreciate
for
it.
having me.
Oh, anytime. This is one of my former professors at the University of New York in Prague. It's been a real pleasure studying here. Of course, I've said this many times in my podcast, but just to dive right in, if you want to tell the audience a bit, about like what you're, maybe not qualified in, but what you're kind of researching. You're coming out with a new book as well. So if you want to tell the audience a bit about your background and that as well, take it away.
Yeah, sure. Thank you once again. And my name is Jan Kovař, as you said, or maybe you haven't. And I teach here at University of New York in Prague, and also I'm a deputy research director at a research-based public institution founded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. The institution actually called the Institute of International Relations. And basically what I do at both institutions, at one more in terms of the educational aspects, at the other one more in terms of the research focused aspects of it, is basically EU politics. Mm-hmm. So I'll actually do two things, but my major role is EU politics, or as we call it, the major European studies, which basically means that I'm focusing on various aspects of European integration and politics in Europe at the intersection of the supranational European Union level at the member state level, so individual countries. So that's what I focus on, and these are basically various aspects of it, how the EU works institutionally. But then next to this kind of a institutional focus, I very much do research and also teach the field of immigration. Not only in relation to the EU, but also in relation to what you can call, media and communication, or even political communication. So I basically focus on how immigration, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and so on and so forth, are basically debated, how they are discursively constructed in the region of Central Europe, because here it's something very new compared to Western Europe, where you do have, or the US even, which is an immigration state. We do not have this kind of, long-lasting experience with immigration from far away. From far away, I mean, from Southeast Asia, for instance, or the Middle East and North Africa, unlike many Western European countries, or the US, or Canada, or Australia. So many other, Western-based countries, or Western countries, how would you basically label them? So this is basically what I do. This is my major EU politics and migration studies.
Okay. I know that, for the Americans tuning in, the European Union is, as he was saying, is a collection of member states. There's 27, right?
Yes.
27?
That's correct.
This is basically a structure where people can vote for representatives. However, there's no leader of Europe in this way. You have the president of the Commission?
You do. You do have the president of the European
Council.
Council.
Von der Leyen is.
Yes.
She's the council or the Commission?
The Commission. She's
okay.
The Commission president.
So these are some of the leaders of Europe, but Europe doesn't have there's no. It's not like the president of the United States. It's much different. So for the Americans tuning in, that is definitely a huge difference. I know that we took 3 courses together, and I've definitely learned a lot about the structures, the internal structures of the European Union, and whether it's economic, external, or how the integration played out. This was definitely a very eye-opening class, and to see how, again, like as you were saying, to kind of dive into the topic a little bit, how Western Europe is a bit more migrant-centered than Eastern Europe or Central Europe. However, I will say there is a large Vietnamese population in the Czech Republic, and I didn't actually know this until I came here. However, correct me if I'm wrong. I know this is what I was told, is that during the Vietnam War, the former regime in Czechoslovakia, they offered a lot of opportunities to people migrating from Vietnam to former Czechoslovakia. But I was hoping you could expand on that, because I don't really know too much about it. I know it had to do with college or work status, things of this nature?
Yes, yeah, actually both. And it's not only that, and the Vietnam War, it's generally the, and this is where I said, we do not really have that a long-lasting experience with immigration. We haven't had such experience until, 2 decades ago, let's say. But then, the Vietnamese and people from the Southeast Asian region, but mostly Vietnamese, started to coming, I would say, back. Because they had certain roots here, some of them, because of this communist era experience. So during the Cold War, let's say, or the era of communist rule in Czechoslovakia, Vietnam, obviously after the war, being part of the Eastern Bloc as well, has become a country, part of the bloc, basically. And Vietnam, within the Eastern Bloc, was one of the countries, not the only one. You could speak of Syria, you could speak of some other countries as well. But Vietnam was one of the countries, countries which had closest ties with Czechoslovakia in terms of student exchange. So this was both ways, basically.
Did this come out of nowhere, kind of, or what was the catalyst for such, even the student exchange? Like, where did that originate?
This has been ideological.
Okay.
Being basically part of Eastern Bloc, and then there was some interest in industrial exchange.
Okay, all right.
So economic, basically exchange, economic, mutual trade,
And this kind of led to that.
and this eventually led to even more deeper people-to-people cooperation. So study exchanges, both ways basically, but more I would say from Vietnam to Czechoslovakia. So you did have a lot of students, doing university degrees here. Some of them even settling for longer for labor purposes. But mostly this was, I would say the student exchange. So educational level. Now, even if you look to Vietnam, for instance, they do have many breweries that brew actually beer the way we do here in Czechia or Central Europe. So not the Belgian way, if I put it like this, but the Czech way, the Pilsner way. And this is exactly because these people used to study here. They they liked the beer. They returned back to Vietnam.
And they brought it with them.
And they brought it with them. So you could find a lot of those, kind of individual issues that have been transferred, including beer brewing. But that's why eventually, I would say within the last 2 decades or so, 25 years maybe, there has been an intake of people from Vietnam because they did have certain roots back in the days. So they decided to travel to Europe, to settle up here in Czechia, but not only Czechia, it's Poland, Slovakia as well. So you could say that, Central European region has a, kind of wider experience with Vietnamese minority.
So this kind of phenomenon of these people moving here really got started kind of at the end of the Cold War, or like were there more people here in the 70s and 80s?
It's already 70s.
There were many people here from there already.
Yes.
Okay,
It's already 70s where more intensive exchanges started. So 70s and 80s would be the period of the most intensive, let's say, exchange between Vietnam and Czechoslovakia.
Now, kind of moving into the 80s and the 90s and the late 90s, would you say that they were still like the dominant group of people coming in to the Czech Republic?
Besides people from the post-communist Europe, so, the post-Soviet space,
people were moving about in there.
Yeah, I mean, like Ukrainians, you do have a lot of Ukrainians here in Slovakia, Poland, Czechia. Czechoslovakia bordered Ukraine. Now we don't because Slovakia does, Poland does. So you do have basically, generally, you can say people from the post-Soviet space, so that, Soviet republics. And then the second largest group would basically be the Vietnamese.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and if you look at it from a perspective of geographic distance, it's quite logical that people from the post-Soviet ways, appeared in certain amounts in Central Europe, but much less likely for, the Vietnamese to appear. So in this sense, you could say that this has been the main migration group, of people, in terms of ethnicity, that has, arrived or migrated to Czechia, not only Czechia, since the, mid 1990s.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say again, like I was very surprised coming here. I had no clue about that. I heard this kind of, not so in depth, but I heard this story a bit from like one of my classmates, and I was like, oh, okay, that's very interesting. Nowadays, though, in class we talked about this too, the migration crisis of 2015?
15, 16.
Okay. I know that the Czech Republic was one of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that was not really so forthcoming. They wanted to be a bit more like, okay, let's make sure we're doing the right thing here. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little further. Kind of like maybe not the attitude, but it's for sure that in the West, countries like France and even you could argue Germany as well, they're trying to be very open to all these people, and they you saw what happened in Germany and France, in those years when it comes to the the crises that occurred. People were getting killed in certain cities, and there were a lot of terrorist attacks. I know that in France in 2016, there was like a nightclub shooting that killed almost 200 people.
Bataclan, yes.
So, it's you can't say that all these people coming in are bad. Obviously not. The vast majority of them, if not, the tiniest percentile, that point something of these people are the ones that are going to create these problems. But I'm really curious to hear how you want to expand on it.
I would say generally this is even more complicated when you look at most of the terrorist attacks that have occurred in well, there have been some in Germany, but Belgium, France, around 2015, 2016, or the UK. There was this concert of well, I forgot the name of the artist, but famous artist.
I think I remember this happening as well.
In Manchester, a famous artist for the youngsters, and I'm apparently already old. If Ariana Grande it was actually. Whatever. Okay. But if you look at those, actually. There were some also in Italy, minor ones using knife and so on and so forth. But absolute minority of them, pretty much negligible minority, were actually conducted by the immigrants who came during the crisis. So it's the linkages between terrorism and the people coming during the crisis of 2015 and 16, they're actually not there really. These have been people who have mostly, in absolute majority of cases, have already been citizens of EU member states or European countries. Second or third generation French, German, Belgian, and so on and so forth. So linking it to immigration, I mean, yes, you can perhaps do that in a longer term perspective because they are second, third generation, so their parents or grandparents have to migrate to Europe. However, there was no direct linkage between the people coming in 2015 and 16 and the occurrence of terrorist attacks. However, in the general discourse, at least in Central Europe, but also elsewhere, as politicians they were trying to exploit this and saying, you see, these are people, and they are a threat. They are a security threat. We have to, prevent them, from coming because this is, what's going to happen. But these two, as I said, were not direct related, and rather they were actually unrelated.
So these people that are, second and third generation, they must have been radicalized in some form.
Yes.
Which is unfortunate, but yeah, that is an interesting point because I would agree that a lot of the politicians took that as talking points. And,
it's an opportunity,
threat.
Right?
Yeah, of course, and we see that happening
because most
in the
people,
US
most
well.
people actually don't know and will not, inquire who did this, who did that, and even if the media will say some were second or third generation, they will kind of implicitly link it to immigration anyway.
Right.
So, as I said, from a longer term perspective, it's clearly a certain problem of perhaps failed integration policies, which obviously are linked to immigration because you do have integration policies following previous immigration, but it was not this, now people are coming from Syria, there's going to be a terrorist attack in a week. But this is very often the shortcut that certain politicians, especially on the radical right, were trying to do to kind of get political advantage. And from that, I wanted to get to Central Europe. The argument here was we were very much, Czechia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania as well. We actually were very much against the relocation system, the quotas for refugees, they used to call them. Formally, it's the relocation mechanism, which should basically ensure that not all refugees come to Germany, Italy, Greece, as countries of first entrance, or France or Sweden.
Right.
But that there is a certain kind of, fair distribution of, this kind of burden, how they called it. Asylum burden, so that everybody participates. However, we said no, we don't want to do that because, and then we linked it to immigration, to terrorism. We linked immigration.
I see.
So we said we don't want these terrorists here. You see, we can observe Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on and so forth. And you see, they do have problems with those, people, and we don't want this, to have it here. So we learned the lessons of these Western European countries, and our response is we need to stop immigration and not relocate immigrants into our countries.
And the terrorism itself spawns, again, not from these people who are just coming in,
Yes,
but it's the people that have been there for a while.
Yeah, well, usually second, third generation.
I just wanted to kind of remark a little bit. At the very beginning, we talked about how, Eastern or Central and Eastern European states don't have this kind of legacy of immigration that, the United States has, or even some Western European countries have. But it's been my understanding, everyone, who's, learning about history, they can form their own kind of conclusions about what they're reading. From what I understand, I think Europe is a bit less suited to, immigration en masse that we've seen, in the United States. Just because that our national character, you could say this for Canada too, but even then it's a small step back. It's about the same. But the United States, from its kind of inception, was always a melting pot, despite the fact that, at the very beginning, you only had, select groups of Europeans there. You had some Africans there. You had, Native Americans there. I believe there were some Asians, but the number must have been tremendously small, because on the eastern seaboard, it's, the other side of the world. Even in my hometown, there are two graves of two people who were, I don't know if they were Turkish, but it says something about the Ottomans on their graves.
Okay.
I don't know like where in the Ottoman Empire they must have been from. They could have been from the Balkans. They could have been from, the Levant. But I will say that I think Europe is a bit less suited to this just because, you look at the other parts of the world, other civilization areas, America has its own civilization going. I would argue the European Union is a civilization, that obviously has these, boundaries inside. You have the Orthodox world, you have, Protestant countries up in Scandinavia. But, they all share these kinds of norms and values that the European Union kind of professes. But, unless that there is a history of countries kind of, determining that they want to be this melting pot and that, it's not only assimilation, but it's kind of like what can this culture add to the overall culture? I feel like that's where the U.S. and Europe as a whole kind of diverge a bit. Because in Europe, there's a bit of we want to hold on to what makes someone French. That there was a law in France that actually they're trying to ban or kind of make it a bit more difficult to wear the hijab. Or in Austria they were doing this too. I don't really have the specifics on it, but I heard a little bit about this in the news, and all that had me thinking was that from an American perspective, people would go bananas about this just because there's a big, like, the government can't tell me, what to wear and, what to think and what values are they purveying because, in America it's this, and that. But I just thought I'd kind of share that kind of side of it where we are trying to kind of not only assimilate, but what can this bring in? You go to the cities in America and, you could find food from literally every corner of the world. You go to New York City, you'll find food from every continent easily without any problem. And then, other places like that. But I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are.
I mean, like, I wouldn't On the one hand, yes. Clearly, historically, the U.S., Australia as well, perhaps, and Canada, some of the countries in the world, they are what we call immigration states.
Yeah,
so
settler immigration
their
states.
origin is, immigration states. But at the end of the day, if you look at the longer history of, and on the other hand, if you look at the longer history of mankind, people, they do have migration in their human nature, I would say. I mean, like the history of humankind is history of migration, right? If you look from a longer term perspective.
Of course, we all come from
at the end of the
Kenya,
day.
Tanzania, Ethiopia area.
So eventually we all had to migrate,
Yeah.
But what makes perhaps Europe, and here you do have the cleavage between Western Europe and I would say Central and Eastern Europe, different is the more recent history. Because if you look into all the history, Czechoslovakia was part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. That has been a multinational, like Austria-Hungary, right? You do already have two leading nations, Hungary and Austria, basically, or nations, ethnicities in the sense and languages. So German, and Hungarian has been spoken, but Czech has been spoken, Poland was part of, today's Poland was part of that as well.
Yeah, Krakow area.
Not because it was Prussia, but not entire Poland, but part of that as well. So you do had, many, parts of Ukraine, of today's Ukraine, were part of the empire as well, and this has been basically multinational, multilingual, empire. However, then since 1918, the end of World War I, and especially after the end of World War II, immigration has been stopped in this region, because it has been part of the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah.
And there has not been, this kind of, multinational, multilingual, multi-ethnic society actually built it in Czechoslovakia. All of these countries had certain minorities, like you do have Romanians in Hungary, you do have Hungarians in Czechoslovakia or Slovakia today, and you can go on, but it was not they were not immigration states, borders were closed, people could not leave,
Very sedimentary.
Yeah.
Like things aren't moving.
Then this recent history, the past 60 years, let's say, that is 50 years after World War II, the end of World War II, made Czechoslovakia or Central Europe very different migration-wise to Western Europe. So while in Western Europe you do see, it's a different extent of immigration perhaps than in the US, because they are not immigration states. The UK was the immigration state in a sense because of the Commonwealth, but it was not created as an immigration state, but because of the existence of Commonwealth, you did have people from India, you did have people from African countries in Africa, you did have people from the Middle East, because this is where Commonwealth was as well. So technically speaking, this has led to the last 60 years has led massively to a divergence between Eastern and Western Europe. And even if you have this divergence between US and Western Europe would in many sense be more similar in terms of ethnic and religious, cultural composition of their societies. And it will be more alike to the US than to Czechia, for instance. If you look to Czechia or Poland, these are highly ethnically homogeneous countries, right? So we do have Slovaks as the major minority. We now do have Vietnamese. We do have Ukrainians, but this is pretty much it. Now, why the response of Central Europe during the migration crisis of 2015 and 16 was so negative, let's say, was that the crisis was represented and constructed primarily in terms of people coming from the Middle East and North Africa, right? And mostly Muslim. And that was we don't have this experience. We don't have these people in here, even though we cooperated with Syria during the communist era. It was more always based on this religious, Christian, If you're Syrian and Christian, you can come. That's
but if
fine.
you're Muslim, it's not.
But if you're Muslim, we can see from Western Europe and even the US that it doesn't work. You see, that's the 9/11, that's all the terrorist attacks, that's, and many politicians then used to use the argument, this is, incompatibility of cultures, right? And we have the lessons learned from the West and the US as well, and we should not, allow this to happen in here. So they use this kind of cultural or civilizational incompatibility argument, but it's highly, from my perspective, this is highly questionable whether something like this even exists, right? However, making multiple cultures work together, multiple ethnicities and religions, well, obviously needs to need some work. It's not like that. It's gonna happen without any problems. Just itself. It needs to there needs to be certain political involvement and so on and so forth. However, I would not buy into the argument that certain countries are more keen or made to be able to integrate multiple, cultures, civilizations, religious, ethnicities, whatever you call it, and some of them are less. Because, as I said at the beginning, I guess that's partly, the human nature of humankind is to migrate and basically, eventually integrate cultures.
At the end of the day, it's just people,
At the end of the day, it's just people. And obviously, on the other hand, we do all have this kind of ethnocentrism. So we always perceive our habits, norms, whatever you can call it, culture, very often, to a certain extent, superior to the others. And it doesn't have to be different ethnicity. It can just sometimes be your neighbor. Yeah. If they have a mess on the on a garden, you will say, we're not. We're better. You feel, look, my garden is pretty neat and clean and everything.
Like I cut my grass.
Yes, exactly. So it doesn't have to be. Sometimes you do look at neighbors and you say, oh well, they have different habits, they have different norms, and you feel that yours are better. Right, sometimes. And then if you just transfer this to a higher level, not neighbors, not neighborhoods, but cultures, nations, ethnicities, religions, and so on and so forth, you can obviously see how while people's human nature is to migrate, in their human nature is also this kind of certain amount of ethnical and cultural superiority, perspective that you are superior, that myself and other, basically this kind of ethnocentrism. So that this always mitigates against easier cohabitation of different groups of people, however you define the groups. But this is where certain, traveling works very well for that. If you do travel, you kind of, brush your ethnocentrism, obviously, because you see, well, different cultures, they're perfectly fine as well, or different ethnicities. But this is where perhaps you sometimes need to have this stepping off of the political level to try to, cultivate that. And in Central Europe, they do the other way around. They do basically say to people, no, these are the terrorists. These are the culturally different. They are not compatible because they feel that they can get a political advantage on that, exactly because the societies here are basically homogeneous, at least in Czechia.
So you can kind of play off this attitude of inexperience with this immigration.
And steering fear, because we don't know that, so anything you don't know, raises fear very often. So that's where I would say that's the failure of the political level to make it happen, and at the same time, it's the opportunity of the political level to basically get political advantage in terms of being negative towards immigration, because of the inexperience. This is the basis of the people in here, because that's what their experience is. We live here as Czechs, and anything different we don't really have experience with. So it's easier for a politician to play this card rather than the card, oh, this culture will enrich us.
Okay. I know we're getting kind of close to the end here, but I do want to throw in at least one question. So let's see what we have here. So in the reading that there was this kind of these analytical distinctive categories that you designed for, I think, the politicization, if I'm saying that right, the dimensions of politicization with regard to immigration. What can you tell us a bit about these?
I was basically in my upcoming book that you're free to look at.
Definitely check his book out, guys.
It's called Debating Immigrants and Refugees in Central Europe. It's going to be published in summer with Routledge. But anyway, what I do look, I guess too, and I know we're coming to close, but the analytical categories of politicization is basically to what extent immigration has become salient, salient political issue or socio-political issue.
Okay.
So the amount of it. I looked also at polarization. So how much different opinions were appearing basically in the discourse. Were there only one basically stream of opinions, or was there polarization? So people kind of advocating for different positions. And I then also looked for what I call what is called actor expansion.
Okay.
So how many different groups of people, politicians, and other, NGO representatives, and so on and so forth. How many of those groups were actually involved in debating immigration? Was that basically only governmental parties or government and opposition, was there, civil society input and so on and so forth? And what I basically found is not extremely surprising. First, that immigration before the crisis, 2015-16 crisis in Czechia and Slovakia, was pretty absent in the discourse. It was not a topic, not a key political topic at all. This has changed very quickly in 2015. So since let's say March 2015, this has changed, and immigration actually became one of the most salient topics.
And this worked. If you bear with me, this probably worked in advantage to those people who were using it as a wedge issue because it was so fast.
Yes.
Oh my God! Like everyone got surprised by
yes.
what was happening. So they used this kind of event as a kind of tool for their.
Like a political leverage, basically.
Yeah. Okay. That's.
Yeah. For a political advantage, because it was a non-issue. So no party was basically the owner of it,
and then suddenly.
So now
it was
you
there.
see, you do have an option to try to grab the issue, and build your reputation as a political leader or politician, to build your party and your parties and your own reputation on the issue. And basically all of the parties try to do that.
Right.
So it resulted in a very high alliance, but at the same time there was no high polarization because all the parties kind of agreed.
There was no diversity of
There was no polarization. There was no diversity. Most of the politicians and most of the people, making immigration salient were anti-immigration leaning.
Do you think that there would have been room for a party? Let's say one party, like maybe a larger party, that's like, hey, actually we disagree. We think that we should bring these people in. Wouldn't that have been almost political suicide for that party to kind of engage in this discussion? Or do you think, because in the U.S. at least, like this is coming from the American side, as soon as one side grabs an issue, the other side takes the other side, and it causes a lot of polarization.
In the U.S., because of the two-party system, this is much easier. In Europe, this is much more complicated because of the multi-party, competition. I wouldn't say political suicide, but if you want to be a mainstream party at that point in time, and you decided, to be pro-immigration. That would not really be compatible, most likely.
Yeah.
So there would be a space for such a political party, but not for such a party to gain 30 or 35% of the vote.
I see.
Right?
I see.
On the other hand, eventually there appeared, parties that have been more pro-integration or pro-immigration, exactly, getting against this, mainstream, trying to grab it from a different perspective, because they believed, well, actually in the society there are people who are in favor of it, or not at least as negative as the majority. So we need to offer them, or we want to offer them, this choice, of voting for us based on their immigration attitudes. But 2015, 2016, there was very little space for political parties to be openly pro-immigration, because this would not have been rewarded by the voters, most likely.
Okay. We're kind of reaching towards the end here. I don't know if you want to leave the audience with one little piece of information that you want to end on. One
little piece of information that we already touched upon. But in the book and in my research, what I did is that I was looking how different groups or categories of immigrants are actually framed. And this very much underlines what we have discussed. You do have distinctions in terms of region of origin.
Yep.
So people from Eastern Europe, let's say the post-communist space, or Southeast Asia, they are usually framed differently in economic terms than people from the Middle East and North Africa, which are more likely to be framed in negative security and cultural terms. And another issue, and similar to that, and we have already mentioned that as well, is religious. So people with, Christian and perhaps, Jews as well, but they're not that much discussed here, but mostly Christians. So the Christian denomination or Christians in general, refugees or immigrants being labeled as Christians are framed very differently, more often in humanitarian and positive terms, and less often in security and negative cultural terms than people with Muslim religious denomination or basically Muslims in general. So you do clearly say that there are, when speaking about immigrants here in Central Europe, we do clearly differentiate between different, self and others. And the self is more Christian and from a ethnically close region of, Central Europe, Ukraine, post-Soviet space, but also today the Vietnamese as well, because we do already have the experience. But the other is clearly and Christians, and the other is clearly, Muslim and mostly from Middle East and North Africa region, which, by the way, tells you that 20 years ago, perhaps the debates about Vietnamese would have been very different than they are now. So it's not like predisposition that it has to be always negative. There is an evolution. And this is where I would say that the intervention of the politicians, the political level, having certain effect on the society, trying to, communicate something in a certain way, immigration in a certain way, is crucial. And this is why I would eventually say that there are no countries more or less predisposed to immigration. But I would say that the discourse in the countries, how it evolves, the discourse regarding immigration, to a large extent, influences or affects to a certain extent what the people what the people's approach to immigration is.
Yeah, I would say the dialogue is definitely the leader there. We could go on all day about this. Really, I'm sorry I got to cut it short. We're over 6 minutes, but I think that people learned a lot today. If you're more interested, guys, please check out his book, Really Bright Mind, and something that is definitely worth reading. Thank you for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, and apologies for being too long.
No,
you
it's
had
fine.
to run a little over
It's absolutely no problem. I think my longest was about 39 minutes, so I always try and get
perfect.
Before
Thanks for introduction, and good luck with your podcast and everything else as well.
Yeah, you as well. Good luck with the book. Cheers, guys. Check out the next episode. Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.